The dust was not a visitor. It was the lord of the land. It reigned from a throne of cracked earth and ruled with a scepter of shimmering heat. Cal Merritt felt it as a second skin, a fine grit that coated his tongue and settled in the weary lines around his eyes. His ranch, once a hopeful patch of green carved from the Arizona Territory's stubborn hide, was now a study in shades of brown and ochre. The creek bed was a pale, bony scar. The cottonwoods by the house held their leaves like brittle, forgotten prayers. Even the sky, a vast and merciless expanse of blue, seemed bleached of its color, beaten into submission by a sun that knew no mercy. For 2 years, the rain had refused to come, and in its absence, everything had begun to shrink. The cattle, the well, his world. Loneliness was a physical presence, as tangible as the heat. It sat with him at the rough-hewn table where his wife, Eleanor, had once laid out supper. It rode with him as he checked the fences that guarded nothing but dust. It was in the silence of the house, a silence so profound it seemed to have weight, pressing down on him, amplifying the creak of a floorboard into a cry of protest. The warnings from his neighbors were a different kind of pressure. They spoke of the Apache, driven from the high country by the drought and the army, moving through the lowlands like desperate ghosts. "They're starving, Cal," Silas Blackwood had told him just last week, his face a mask of grim certainty. "And a starving dog will bite any hand, even one that offers a scrap." The advice was always the same: shoot first, ask no questions. Keep your well guarded and your rifle clean. Cal listened, nodded, and said little. He had seen the fear in their eyes, a brittle anger that came from watching their own livelihoods wither on the vine. But he had also seen the tracks, delicate and fleeting in the dust near the dry wash, the small prints of children's moccasins alongside the adults. He thought of Eleanor, of the 2 small graves on the hill behind the house, marked by simple wooden crosses. He understood desperation. He understood thirst. So when he saw them, he was not surprised. They emerged from the heat haze at the edge of his property, not a war party, but a slow, trudging procession of human misery. There were perhaps 20 of them, mostly women, children, and old men. They moved with a languid exhaustion that spoke of days without water. Their horses were little more than skeletons draped in hide. At their head walked a woman. She was not tall, but she carried herself with a straight-back stillness that drew the eye. Her black hair was bound back, her face etched with the same fatigue and worry as the land itself, but her eyes, even from this distance, seemed to hold a flicker of some unquenchable fire. Cal stood on his porch, the Winchester in his hands, feeling unnaturally heavy. Every instinct, every warning from men like Blackwood screamed at him to raise it, to fire a warning shot, to protect the last dregs of water in his well as a dragon might hoard its gold. He watched them come closer, their progress agonizingly slow. He could see the swollen tongues, the cracked lips, the hollow-eyed stare of children who had forgotten what it felt like to have their thirst quenched. He saw the woman at the front, her gaze fixed on the windmill that stood over his well, a silent, skeletal sentinel. She did not look at him, only at the source of life. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. He could be a good neighbor, a sensible man, or he could be a human being. The choice felt like tearing himself in two. He lowered the rifle, resting its stock on the weathered porch boards, and waited. The silence that stretched between them was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic squeak of the windmill turning in a hot, useless breeze. The woman stopped her people 100 yards from the house, a silent command passing through them. She alone walked forward, her steps measured and deliberate, each one a testament to a will that refused to break. Cal remained on the porch, his hand now resting near the rifle, but not on it, a statement of caution, not threat. As she drew closer, he could see the fine lines of strain around her mouth, the dust caked in her eyebrows. Her gaze was direct, unwavering, and held no plea. It was a look of assessment, of one survivor gauging another. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her eyes finally meeting his. There was no subservience in them, only a profound, soul-deep weariness and a fierce, guarded dignity. He saw in her the reflection of his own struggle against this unforgiving land. He gave a short, stiff nod toward the well. It was the only language that seemed necessary. A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or a momentary easing of a terrible burden, passed across her features before being replaced by the same stoic mask. She turned, raised a hand, and her people moved forward again, not with a rush, but with that same drained, methodical pace. Cal stepped off the porch and walked to the well, his boots crunching on the parched ground. The air was thick with unspoken tension. He felt the weight of their eyes on him, a dozen pairs of dark, unreadable pools of exhaustion and suspicion. He ignored them, focusing on the task at hand. He grabbed the iron handle of the pump, the metal hot enough to burn through his calloused skin. He began to work it, the rhythmic groan and clank of the mechanism a jarring intrusion into the silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. The pipes rattled with emptiness. Then came a gurgle, a reluctant cough, and finally a stream of water, thin and pathetic at first, then thickening, spilling into the stone trough below. It was not cool, but it was wet. It was life. The people gathered, but did not push or shove. The woman, their leader, directed them with quiet gestures. The children went first, scooping the precious liquid with cupped hands, their faces buried in the trough. Then the elders, their movements slow and pained. They drank deeply, their bodies seeming to uncurl from the tight knot of dehydration. The woman waited until last, only allowing herself to drink after everyone else had their fill and they had begun filling their water skins. She knelt by the trough, and as she drank, Cal saw the tension in her shoulders release, just for a second. It was a glimpse of the vulnerability beneath the unyielding strength, a crack in the armor that made her more real, more human than any of Blackwood's hateful stories. He continued to pump, his arms beginning to ache, the sweat stinging his eyes, until every skin was full. The woman rose, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and looked at him. Her eyes held a complex, silent message he could not decipher, but it was not hatred. Then, with a gesture to her people, they turned and began the long, slow walk back the way they had come, melting into the heat from which they had emerged. Cal was left alone with the dripping pump, the damp earth, and the profound certainty that he had just sealed his fate. 3 days crawled by, each one hotter and longer than the last. The sun hammered the roof of the small ranch house, turning the air inside into a suffocating blanket. Cal moved through his chores with a listless efficiency, his mind replaying the scene at the well. He expected repercussions. He imagined Silas Blackwood riding up with a few other ranchers, their faces tight with accusation. He imagined the whispers in the dusty street of the nearest town, the cold shoulders, the isolation deepening until it was a canyon he could not cross. He was a pariah now, a man who had given aid and comfort to the enemy. He found he did not care as much as he thought he would. The memory of the children's faces as they drank, of the woman's guarded, weary dignity, had rooted itself deep inside him, a strange and stubborn kind of solace. On the third afternoon, as the shadows began to lengthen into long, distorted fingers across the baked earth, he saw a rider. It was a lone figure, moving not with the hurried gait of a messenger or the aggressive posture of a threat, but with a familiar, measured pace. His breath caught in his chest. It was her. Nady, as he would later learn she was called, though for now she was just the woman from the well. She rode the same tired horse, and she was alone. This was a new and more dangerous development. A lone Apache woman was a target, a provocation. For her to come here, to his ranch, was an act of either profound trust or profound foolishness. He did not know which. He watched from the porch as she dismounted at the same spot her people had halted, 100 yards out. She did not approach the house. She simply stood by her horse, a small bundle in her hands, and waited. The gesture was clear. She would not intrude. The next move was his. He hesitated for only a moment, his ingrained caution warring with a powerful and unfamiliar curiosity. He left the rifle inside, a conscious choice, and walked out to meet her, the sun hot on the back of his neck. The silence between them was as vast and empty as the landscape. She watched him approach, her expression unreadable, her body perfectly still. She was a part of the landscape, as resilient and unyielding as the ancient, weathered rock formations that dotted the horizon. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the intricate beadwork on her moccasins, the faint scar that traced the line of her jaw. He smelled the scent of dust and sage and wood smoke that clung to her. He could not read her thoughts, could not guess her intentions, and the not knowing was a strange mix of unnerving and exhilarating. For so long, his world had been predictable, a monotonous cycle of work and grief. This woman was a disruption, a question mark in the flat, declarative sentence of his life. He waited for her to make the first move, ceding a control he hadn't realized he was holding so tightly. He felt as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground uncertain beneath his feet, and yet he felt no urge to step back. Nady held out the bundle. It was wrapped in a piece of worn buckskin, tied with a simple leather thong. Her movements were economical, devoid of any flourish. She offered it not as a supplicant, but as an equal. Cal looked from the bundle to her face. Her eyes were dark and deep, and they held his gaze without wavering. There was no artifice in her, no hidden agenda he could detect, only a straightforward gravity that commanded respect. He reached out and took the bundle. The buckskin was soft and warm from her hands. He slowly unwrapped it. Inside lay two items. The first was a basket, so tightly woven it could hold water, the geometric patterns a dizzying display of skill and patience. The colors, derived from desert plants, were muted yet beautiful. Beside it lay a small, heavy ornament of hammered silver, shaped like a dragonfly, its surface catching the dying light of the afternoon sun. It was payment. It was more than payment. It was a refutation of any debt, a statement that her people were not beggars. They had taken water, a gift of survival, and now they offered a gift of craft, of beauty, of their own enduring culture in return. He understood instantly. To refuse it would be a profound insult, a dismissal of her dignity and the dignity of her people. He looked up at her, a lump forming in his throat. He wanted to say something, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate. How could he explain the turmoil of the past few days, the fear, the defiance, the strange sense of rightness his actions had given him? There was no shared language for such things. He gave a slow, deliberate nod of acceptance. He turned without a word and walked back to the small storehouse behind his home. He returned a few moments later with a heavy canvas sack of flour and several links of dried, salted beef. He held them out to her. It was not charity, it was trade, an exchange between equals. She accepted the provisions with the same solemn grace with which she had offered her gift. Her fingers brushed his as she took the sack, a brief, fleeting contact that sent a jolt of unexpected warmth through him. She secured the goods to her saddle, then mounted her horse in a single, fluid motion. Before she turned to leave, she met his eyes one last time. There was a flicker of something new in them, a seed of understanding, perhaps even of trust. Then she was gone, riding into the twilight, leaving Cal standing alone in the vast silence, the silver dragonfly cool and heavy in his palm. He closed his hand around it, the metal pressing into his skin, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he was not entirely alone in this world. That first exchange set the cadence for a new, unspoken rhythm in Cal's life. Every 10 days or so, like clockwork, Nady would appear on the horizon as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the mountains. The ritual was always the same. She would wait at a distance. He would walk out to meet her. They would trade. Her offerings were a map of her people's existence. Potent medicinal herbs gathered from a hidden canyon, a perfectly tanned deer hide, a set of finely chipped arrowheads, a small clay pot filled with piñón nuts. They were items of survival and skill, each one telling a story of resilience. In return, he gave her what he had an abundance of from his trips to town: sacks of beans and cornmeal, blocks of salt, coffee, once a small sharp axe head he'd had no use for. They rarely spoke. The gulf of language was too wide, but it also felt unnecessary. Their communication existed in the quiet spaces between actions. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the way a tightening of her jaw meant her people were struggling, the slight relaxation in her shoulders when a hunt had been successful. He imagined she was learning to read him too, the deepening weariness in his own face as the drought wore on, the way he would stand and stare at the two small graves on the hill when he thought no one was watching. He found himself anticipating her visits, watching the horizon in the late afternoons, a knot of quiet expectation tightening in his chest. Her presence was a crack of light in the sealed room of his solitude. He once found a small, brightly colored bird with a broken wing near the barn. He carefully splinted the wing with twigs and strips of cloth and kept the bird in a small wooden box, feeding it water and seeds. On Nadi's next visit, after their trade was complete, he gestured for her to wait. He returned with the box and showed her the bird. She looked at the splinted wing, then at him, her expression softening for the first time into something he could almost name. It wasn't a smile, not quite, but a crinkling at the corners of her eyes, a momentary lifting of her stoic mask. She reached out and gently stroked the bird's head with one finger. It was a small moment, utterly insignificant to the rest of the world, but for Cal it felt momentous, a bridge built across the chasm of their different worlds with a single, shared act of gentleness. When she rode away that day, he felt the silence she left behind was not empty, but resonant, filled with the echo of that shared moment. He was no longer just trading goods with an Apache leader, he was sharing a piece of his life with a woman named Nadia. The whispers finally found their voice in Silas Blackwood. He rode over one morning, his horse kicking up angry plumes of dust, his face set in a familiar mask of self-righteous fury. He didn't bother with pleasantries, dismounting and striding toward Cal, who was mending a harness on the porch. "I've seen the tracks, Merritt," Blackwood spat, his voice low and venomous. "A single rider, coming and going regular as Sunday prayers. Don't lie to me, you're trading with them." He said the last two words as if they were a foul curse, an accusation of the highest treason. Cal slowly set down his leatherworking tools. He rose to his feet, his movements deliberate, his body a wall of quiet resistance against the other man's encroaching anger. "My tracks are my business, Silas. Not when they put the rest of us at risk." Blackwood's voice rose, cracking with a mixture of fear and rage. "You're giving them supplies. You're making them strong. When they decide to stop trading and start taking, whose door do you think they'll kick in first? Yours? Or mine? Or Fletcher's? You're inviting the fox into the henhouse and expecting the rest of us to thank you for it." "They've done no harm," Cal said, his own voice dangerously quiet. "They needed water. I gave it. Now we trade. That's the end of it." "The end of it?" Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This is the beginning. They see you as a soft touch. They're marking you, learning your habits. And when their bellies are full with your flour and their quivers are full of arrows, what then? You think that squaw leader of theirs will remember your kindness? They understand one thing, Merritt: strength. And you are showing them nothing but weakness." Cal's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The casual, dismissive way Blackwood spoke of Nadia ignited a protective fire in his gut that surprised him with its intensity. "She has more honor in her little finger than you have in your whole body, Silas. Now get off my land." Blackwood's eyes narrowed into slits. "This ain't over. The others, they're listening to me now. They see what you're doing is a danger to us all. You need to pick a side, Cal. And you're picking the wrong one." He turned, swung himself back onto his horse with a violent motion, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and acrid threats hanging in the air. Cal stood on the porch for a long time, the silence that returned feeling heavier, more menacing than before. The quiet world he had built with Nadia was about to be shattered, and he knew, with a sinking heart, that the coming storm would demand a price far greater than a sack of flour. A week later, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, Nadia appeared. Cal felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The air was different, charged with a new and volatile energy. He could feel unseen eyes on them from the low hills that bordered Blackwood's property. He knew Silas wasn't just making idle threats. He was watching, waiting for an opportunity. As Nady dismounted, Cal met her halfway, his steps quick and urgent. He had to make her understand the danger. He held up a hand to halt their usual ritual of trade. He pointed eastward, toward Blackwood's ranch, his face grim. He made a shape of a long rifle with his hands, then drew a finger across his own throat. He didn't know if the gestures were clear, if they conveyed the depth of the malice he had seen in Silas's eyes. He could only try. He repeated the motion, his expression pleading with her to comprehend the severity of the threat. Nady watched him, her own face a study in concentration. She looked toward the hills he indicated, her gaze sweeping the horizon, missing nothing. She was a hunter, a survivor. She knew how to read the land for signs of danger far better than he ever could. When her eyes returned to his, there was a new hardness in them, a warrior's cold assessment. She understood. She did not show fear, only a quiet, dangerous resolve. She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a small object. It was a bird, carved from a piece of dark wood, its wings outstretched in flight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every feather detailed with a patient, loving hand. It was not part of their trade, it was a gift, a token. She pressed it into his palm, her fingers closing over his for a brief, firm moment. The gesture was freighted with meaning he could only guess at, a thank you, a farewell, a warning. He closed his own hand around the carving, the wood smooth and cool against his skin. Before she mounted her horse, she gave him one last, long look. It was a look that communicated a shared understanding of the peril they were in. It acknowledged the flimsy peace they had built and the violence that was coming to tear it down. Then, with a subtle shift of her weight, she urged her horse not back the way she came, but toward a series of rocky outcrops that offered better cover, a more defensible path. As she disappeared from view, Cal clutched the wooden bird, the fragile symbol of their connection, and knew that the next time he saw Silas Blackwood, it would not be a conversation. It would be a reckoning. The reckoning came 2 days later, just after dusk. The last light was bleeding from the sky, painting the undersides of the clouds in violent streaks of orange and purple. Cal had just finished watering his horse, his senses on high alert. The world had grown too quiet, the insects silent, the air still and expectant. He saw the flicker of lantern light first, a bobbing, malevolent star moving across the plain from the direction of Blackwood's ranch. Then another, and another. A grim procession of armed men, their shapes dark and ominous against the dying light. There were 5 of them, led by Silas, their faces illuminated by the unsteady glow, twisted with whiskey-fueled courage and righteous hate. They were not quiet. They rode into his yard with a clatter of hooves and a chorus of jeers, their intentions brutally clear. "Merritt!" Blackwood's voice boomed, thick with false bravado. "We've come to collect the toll, payment for harboring savages." Cal stepped out of the barn, the heavy 10-gauge shotgun held loosely in his hands, its twin barrels pointing toward the ground. He had been expecting them. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the cold, clear certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose but a principle. "There's nothing for you here, Silas. Turn around and ride home before you do something you can't take back." "Oh, we're not going anywhere," another man, Fletcher, sneered. "Not until we've cleaned this nest out. We know she's been here. We're going to wait. And when she comes back, we're going to give her a proper welcome." Suddenly, a movement at the edge of the rocks behind the barn caught everyone's attention. It was Nady. She had not been coming to the ranch. She had already been there, concealed, watching. Perhaps she had seen the riders coming. Perhaps she had known this confrontation was inevitable. She stepped into the clearing, a bow in her hand, an arrow nocked but not drawn. Her face was impassive, a mask of stone in the flickering lamplight. Blackwood's face split into a triumphant, ugly grin. "Well, look what we have here. Saved us the wait." He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at her. "This ends tonight, Merritt, you and your pet." In that split second, everything slowed down. Cal saw the glint of the hammer on Blackwood's pistol, the tightening of his finger on the trigger. He saw Nady standing alone, exposed, yet utterly defiant. Without a conscious thought, he moved, stepping directly between Blackwood and Nady, raising the shotgun until its barrels were level with Silas's chest. "You'll have to go through me," Cal said, his voice low and steady, devoid of the tremor he felt deep in his bones. The yard fell silent, the standoff frozen in a tableau of imminent violence, the lanterns casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping claws. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, ready to snap. The snap, when it came, was deafening. Blackwood, enraged at Cal's defiance, shifted his aim and fired. The shot went wide, tearing a chunk of wood from the barn wall beside Cal's head, the sound of it echoing like a thunderclap in the enclosed yard. The blast shattered the tense quiet, and the world erupted into chaos. Before Blackwood could fire again, an arrow hissed out of the darkness from the rocks above, striking the pistol from his hand with a sharp crack. It was not from Nady. Her arrow was still knocked, her eyes fixed on the men before her. From the shadows of the rocks, other figures emerged. 3 Apache warriors, silent as ghosts, armed with bows and rifles. They had been there all along, a hidden guard, an unseen promise. Nady had not come alone. She had come prepared. Blackwood's men, their drunken courage evaporating in the face of this sudden, lethal opposition, froze in terror. The hunters had become the hunted. The fight was over before it had truly begun. One of the men dropped his rifle and scrambled back onto his horse, spurring it into a frantic retreat. Another followed, his face pale with fear. Fletcher stood his ground for a moment. Then, seeing the cold, deadly eyes of the warriors fixed on him, he too lost his nerve and fled. Only Silas Blackwood remained, disarmed and humiliated, his face a contorted mask of fury and disbelief. One of the warriors stepped forward, and with the butt of his rifle, struck Blackwood hard across the back of the knees, sending him sprawling into the dust. In his fall, Blackwood's flailing arm knocked over one of the lanterns. It shattered on the dry ground, and a pool of burning oil instantly ignited the tinder-dry hay scattered at the base of the barn wall. Flames erupted with a hungry roar, licking up the old, weathered planks. The confrontation with men was over, but a new, more indiscriminate enemy had been unleashed. The fire. The dry wood of the barn caught with terrifying speed. Flames climbed the wall, casting a hellish, dancing light over the chaotic scene. The smell of smoke and burning pine filled the air, acrid and choking. For a moment, everyone was paralyzed, watching the orange tendrils of destruction consume the structure that represented the sum of Cal's life's work. Then, instinct took over. Cal dropped his shotgun and ran for the water trough, grabbing the 2 heavy buckets he kept beside it. He plunged them into the water, the shock of the cold a jarring contrast to the heat of the blaze. He turned to see that Nady was already in motion. She shouted a sharp command in her own language, and her warriors, who moments before had been ready to kill, became a disciplined firefighting crew. 2 of them grabbed horse blankets from a nearby rail, soaking them in the trough alongside Cal. The other one, seeing Blackwood still kneeling in the dust, dazed and useless, simply shoved him aside and joined the effort. There were no more enemies, only people against the fire. Cal and Nady's people formed a desperate, unspoken brigade. They worked with a frantic, synchronized rhythm born of pure necessity. Cal would haul the sloshing buckets to the base of the flames, throwing the water against the burning wall, hissing steam rising to meet him. The warriors would use the heavy, soaked blankets to beat at the edges of the fire, trying to smother the blaze, their faces grim with exertion. Nady was everywhere at once, directing their efforts with sharp gestures, her voice calm and authoritative amidst the roar and crackle of the flames. She worked alongside them, her hands raw, her face smudged with soot, her earlier composure replaced by a fierce, practical determination. They fought the fire for what felt like an eternity, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming in protest. The heat was a physical blow, driving them back, but they would regroup and attack again. Cal worked side by side with the man who had nearly shot him moments before, their shared purpose eclipsing their animosity. In the flickering, chaotic light of the fire, all other identities, rancher, Apache, friend, foe, were burned away, leaving only the raw, elemental struggle for survival. Slowly, agonizingly, their efforts began to make a difference. The furious roar of the blaze lessened to a sullen crackle. The towering wall of flame shrank, beaten back inch by inch. They had saved the main structure of the barn, but a large section of the wall was a blackened, gaping wound, smoke still curling from the charred timbers like departing spirits. The sun began to rise as the last of the embers were extinguished, its gentle light illuminating a scene of devastation. The yard was a mess of scorched earth, discarded blankets, and overturned buckets. Blackwood, shamed and defeated, had long since slunk away into the pre-dawn darkness. Nady's warriors, their work done, faded back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared, leaving only her. She stood with Cal amidst the wreckage, both of them covered in soot and sweat, their bodies aching with exhaustion. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was not a silence of caution or uncertainty, but one of shared trial and profound, weary relief. He looked at the ruin of his barn, the physical manifestation of years of toil and hope, now a blackened monument to the night's violence. A wave of despair washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had won the confrontation but lost nearly everything in the process. He felt a light touch on his arm. It was Nady. She stood beside him, her face streaked with soot, her eyes reflecting the first rays of the morning sun. She looked from the scorched barn to his face, and in her gaze he saw not pity, but a deep and quiet understanding. She knew loss, she lived with it every day. Her presence beside him was not an intrusion on his grief, but a buttress against it. He looked down at the hand on his arm, then back to her face. The vast unspoken distance that had always separated them had been consumed by the fire. They had been forged into something new in the heat and chaos of the night, something for which neither of them had a name. He had risked everything for a principle, for an act of human decency, and in doing so had found a connection more real and tangible than the barn he had just lost. The land was still harsh, the world was still cruel, the future was a vast, unwritten territory. But as he stood there with Nady in the quiet dawn, surveying the ashes of his old life, he did not feel the crushing weight of loneliness. He felt the resilient, unyielding strength of a new beginning. He had given a stranger water, and in return, she had shown him what it meant to truly survive. They were no longer just a rancher and an Apache leader. They were partners, standing together against a world that would try to tear them apart, ready to rebuild from the ashes.